So welcome back. Today we want to go over the CSS box model, which is a core concept in CSS for sizing our controls, for adding margins, for adding border margins and padding, and specifying borders as well. We'll talk a little bit about the background properties and a few ways you can configure that. But the thing to know is all the stuff that we talk about today applies to any HTML element that is a block. Okay, all of this stuff applies to blocks. It doesn't apply to inline elements. So what that means is I could say take a div, an h1, and apply any of these things to those kind of tags, but I couldn't apply it to, say, a span or a emphasis or things like that. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about what the objectives are. So as far as applied things we want you to be able to do, we want you to be able to apply CSS to HTML documents that uses these things, including spaces, borders, and backgrounds. We want you to kind of know and understand what the box model is and how to use that, how to understand the different parts of the box model, how to use it for spacing between, for instance, headings and paragraphs on a page. The book talks a little bit about collapsed margins, so we do need to talk about that briefly. I don't think that's on the slides, so I'll just have to kind of bring that up as we get there. We want to talk about a few different properties of block elements. So we're going to talk about the width, the height, the margin, the padding, borders, background colors, and background images, as well as a few other ways to specify backgrounds, namely with gradients is the other one. So there's some new features in CSS3. Again, CSS3 has been around for a few years now, so it's not all that new. So that includes like rounded corners and shadows, which are great. Really helps improve the look of your website and help with readability and different things like that. So let's get into it. So first of all, when we're talking about the box model in CSS, we're talking about how do we size things. Okay, so anytime we're talking about a block, well, that block fits into some sort of square rectangle. Okay, so this thick border that you're seeing here, that's what we call the border. Okay, anything inside of that thick black line, that is the quote-unquote, it's kind of the inside. It's usually what we think about, the inside of the element. Okay, so you've got the border, and then on the inside of the border you've got padding. On the outside of the border you've got margin, and then inside of there we finally have what's called the content. So this little dashed white block in the middle is what we refer to as the content area. So that content, if we say here's the width and the height, by default the width and the height only applies to that content area. By default it does not include the padding or the margin. Now typically we think of paddings kind of used to usually give a little space, as you can kind of see, between the border and the content, so that the border doesn't directly, or the edges of the edges of that don't directly collide with. So there's some space between the kind of the outside border and the inside content. So you can kind of think about maybe a text box or a text field where the user's trying to type in text. You wouldn't want your text to go and hit that border. You want some space inside. And then margin, rather than kind of giving rather than using that for kind of spacing, again, padding is kind of for spacing between the border and the content. Margin is between this element and another element. Okay, so they're not directly overlapping. If I had a zero margin and these two things were stacked on top of each other, well, the borders would be right up next to each other. Okay, so the margin gives us spacing between different elements. Now, there's a lot of sub-properties to this piece, namely that you can specify different borders for each of the four sides. You can specify different padding for each of the four sides, and you can also specify a different margin for each of the four sides. So for instance, up at the top, you can see that we've got margin top. Down at the bottom, we have margin bottom. So those don't have to be the same number. I could say, let's put 30 pixels of margin on the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom. And vice versa, the left and the right can be different values as well. So maybe 40 on the left, 50 on the right. Now, usually speaking, our left and right padding we'll try to keep that the same. But our top and bottom padding, there's a lot of cases where we might want that to be different. And then same thing with padding. So we've got a padding left, a padding right, a padding top, a padding bottom. And we can specify, same way we can specify different paddings on all the four sides. We can specify a different border on each of the four sides. So I might say there's a dashed border on the bottom and a solid border on the top, and maybe no borders on the left and right. We can do things like that because we can control each of the four sides individually. Now, a lot of times we'll go ahead and set all four sides to be the same thing, kind of as a starting point. But there are definitely cases where it makes sense to only apply certain styling to one or two sides. So when you're thinking about the formulas for kind of figuring out what these are, again, notice that the width and the height, if we're setting those, by default, we're just talking about this content in the middle. Okay. Now, that content could be text in the case of, say, a paragraph, but if it's like a div, well, there could be multiple things inside of here. So that content includes everything that's nested inside of that tag, which might just be text, but might be many other things as well. Okay. So by default, if we're setting a width and height, we're just controlling that size. Okay. By default, that does not include margins, borders, and padding, despite what the book will tell you. If you set something to 100% width, which would say I want to take up the full width of the view, it's actually going to, and any margin, border, or padding that you have is going to push the right side off the screen because those things are not included. So that's an important distinction. Now, there's a few different ways to, there's one way to kind of change how that formula works. And this is a relatively new property. It's not actually covered in your book. But there's a property called box sizing. And there's two options for how to do box sizing. So the first one, which is the default, and historically was our only option, is called content box. So in content box, you see that behavior where we say width and height. Well, that applies to just the content, doesn't include the margin or the padding or the border. Okay, so that's the default setting. So if I say an element is 100 pixels by 100 pixels wide, well, that's going to be the content, is going to be that size, and then I'll add the border and the margin, etc. There's a different option, and this is where this becomes really valuable, is I can say box sizing border box. So if I do this, if I change all of my elements over to box sizing border box, now width and heights are not just specified as the size of the content, but it also includes the margin, also includes the padding and the border, but not the margin. Okay, which this can make things a hell of a lot easier to size and lay out your pages because you don't have those sort of errors built in. Because setting a content box, surprise, surprise, tends to usually create some errors with your layout. So that's a big trick to doing layouts nowadays. We'll usually use an universal selector to go ahead and set those things on a global level. So to apply it to all of our tags. So if I'm going to kind of write that out, open up Notepad. What that would mean is if I want to change everything in my website over to that border box, I might add a rule like this at the top of my CSS. So I say box sizing, border box. So that, just adding that first line to your CSS file, that will mean that everything now uses that border box sizing, which usually there's enough benefit to having everything specified as border box that it's usually worth having this as the first line in any CSS style sheet that you create. Again, this usually fixes a bunch of problems with your layout, because kind of the way that makes more sense most of the time is to do this calculation, where the width and height includes not just the size of the content, but it includes the padding and the border. But remember, this does not include the margin, so that's kind of important. This still does not include the margin, but that's okay. Okay. So, one thing that we need to talk about before I kind of leave here is talk about how collapsed margins work. So, by default, let's say I have a margin of 30 pixels. Okay, so a margin of 30 pixels without collapse margin would say, okay, well, this thing needs to be 30 pixels away from the next thing. Say I apply it to all four sides. And I have another thing to the right of it. Well, it's got 30 pixels all the right side. Well, when we're dealing with CSS, and if I remember right, and again, this is in your book, margins that are on the left and right, if two things are next to each other, I don't think those get, if I remember right, those don't get collapsed, but ones on the top and bottom do. So if I have two things next to each other that both have a 30, let's say the left one has a 30 pixel margin and the right one has a 30 pixel margin as well, those will be 60 pixels apart from each other. Whereas in the vertical direction, if I remember right, the vertical direction is where they get collapsed. So there we would have 30 pixels here, and I would say another 30 pixels. Well, you would expect those to be 60 pixels apart. Well, because the margins are collapsed, they'll actually only be 30. So it'll take, what it does is it actually takes the highest of the two in the vertical direction and uses that as the margin, the spacing between the two. So for instance, let's say they're maybe not 30 and 30, maybe one's 30 and 40. Well, if one's got a 30, this one's got a bottom margin of 30, the next one's got a top margin of 40. Well, then these will be 40 apart. So that's just a thing to keep in mind, is those formulas are not as straightforward as just saying that. That's a valuable thing in terms of the borders being collapsed like that tends to be valuable for how things lay out, but it is something you have to kind of keep in mind as you're setting margins. All right, so let's look at an actual example. So I'm going to pull this up in Visual Studio here. So I'm in Book Examples. We're in 2-box model. I already opened this up in with Live Server, the Live Server plugin, so we can kind of see how this looks. So here we have the HTML. So we just have a simple main tag that has a header as well as a paragraph inside of it. Okay, so the actual HTML is fairly simple. But what we can see here is there's a few different things going on, because there's a few different blocks here. So on the outside, we've got the main block, right? And inside of that, we have two blocks, H1 and we have P. Now this is the kind of the final result if I apply all the CSS to it, but maybe it would be worth kind of going through each of these pieces one by one. So I'm going to comment all of it out, and then we're going to add it in piece by piece. So I may have to, because there's comments on here, I may have to remove those comments first, because otherwise I've got a block quote instead of a block quote, and it's not so happy. So by the way, just the keyboard shortcut in Visual Studio, if you want to comment a block, it's control and slash at the same time. So I'm going to comment all these out. Control and slash, control and slash. And comment out those as well. Okay. So here's what we look at. Here's what you'll see if you don't apply any CSS to it, right? So pretty simple. Let's go ahead and start applying these things one by one, and let's see what we can kind of figure out about what's going on. So if I start from the top, let's see, I apply these properties to the body. So the body here, I'm giving it a border, so I can see that kind of dotted border coming up. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. Okay, you can see it's kind of on the outside, and we're also adding margin, right? So the margin you can see out here. The margin is spacing it away from the edges of the viewport. Okay, and one very useful tool as you're working through, especially the box model and working with padding and borders and margin, is we can go and inspect the code, go look at the code. Okay, so let's look at body. Let's look at the body tag right now. Now, if I look at the area down here, see if I can move this around so it's easier to see. May actually just have to make this bigger. Okay, so there we go. So if we're looking at the inspector, so I've got the body selected. You'll see here over on the right is there's this picture, right? And as we hover over it, you can kind of see the colors changing. So this blue area inside, right, that's the content. So it's actually showing us how big it is. And this is specifically in pixels. So it's 843 pixels by 114 right now is the dimensions of the content. I can go up here and I can see, oh, there's dashes, so there's no padding. Right now we haven't applied any padding, which would be kind of in there in between. And you can see that you can kind of see the effect of that because this S is running right up against the border. Right? If there was padding, there would be space there. Next we can kind of look at the border. You'll see it highlighted in the inspector and the window over here. And then we finally have the margin. So you can see where those things are applied, and you can see what those margins and padding and such is. So we can see there's 10 pixels of margin on all four sides. We can see there's 3 pixels of margin, a border on all four sides, not all 3 sides. So let me make this a little bit smaller. And let's go back to what we had here. So I added the styles for the border. Let's go ahead and add the styles now for main. Okay, so what we're going to see, notice how this kind of started to fall off the edge of the screen, right? So that's one of these issues that you can run into. So let's look at what we set. So on main, we've got a border that's 2 pixels wide. We have a width, so we're saying the width of this is 500 pixels. Now note that that's saying that's always 500 pixels. So if I change the size of the viewport, it's always 500 pixels. If it's too small, I do get a scroll bar down at the bottom. But you'll notice as it falls off the screen that it's starting to fall out of this box here, right? So the body should be this box here, that dashed border, but it's actually kind of falling out of the body, which that's not great. That's not what I want to see, right? So when I'm sizing things, I do have to be very careful about setting things, setting widths and heights like this that are, as you might say, absolute, right? That are predefined, and they say they're fixed, they're absolute, they cannot change. So I'm saying 500 pixels. Well, if I'm operating on a device that's narrower than that, then that's going to be a problem. So that's what I'm saying the width to. If I go into the inspector, we can kind of play around with this. So I might pull this up here. Again, let's look at the main, right? So in the inspector, I can see that the width of this is set to 500 and it's roughly 142 pixels wide. I can see that there's 10 pixels of padding here. I can see that there's 2 pixels of border and 20 pixels of margin, right? So those are the different pieces. Now, let's say I turn this width off for a second, and let's see what happens. So if I turn that width off, remember main is a block element, and by default, it's going to be the full width of the viewport. So if I don't specify the width, notice how it automatically kind of sizes the way we want it to, right? So rather than it falling off the screen, if I have a smaller device, it just wraps the text, right? So as it gets smaller, it wraps the text more and more, and this actually becomes taller, right? So this main block, which at a wider screen size, see, is 114 pixels tall. If I make it much smaller, you can start to see that it goes up to, say, 460 pixels tall. Again, that's down to it wrapping the words. So typically that's the behavior you want. You usually want to allow it to word wrap like that, and not explicitly set your widths or your heights to this value, because you can get into a lot of cases there where things fall off screen like that, and it's not terribly mobile friendly. So just that's one thing to be conscious of as you're using these properties, is you still do have to think very much about how is this going to work in a mobile setting, how is this going to be responsive. Okay, so let me size some of these things down. Why is it? It's really wanting to go into that layout, but I don't want it to be in that layout. Okay, well, we'll just leave it here. So that's the main. Let's go to the H1 and the P tags, and let's see what happens there. So if I turn that on, so now we can see two things happening. We can see that there is a border on both the H1 and the P, right? So bordering on both the H1 and the P. Remember that comma means there's two different selectors here that we're applying the same styling to. So we've got a border of 1 pixel and we've got a padding of 10 pixels. So if I'm looking at this here, you can see the space on the outside, that orange space is our margin. Then you've got the border, and then the green is going to be our padding, and then yada yada. And then I can also see, if I look at P, you can see that there's some margin on top and bottom, and you can also see that there's some padding in there. Now, remember on both H1 and P that I have not set any margins. You see that there's no margin set here. Well, you might ask, where are those even coming from? Well, if I look at the code down here, okay, so let's look at what's in the inspector. So if I have the H1 selected, or the P, let's start with the H1, we'll see that, okay, I'm applying border and padding here. Oh, well, my normalized CSS is applying some margin itself, right? So my normalized CSS file that I'm using is applying some margin to the top and bottom. Okay, so that's part of where that's coming from. Also beneath that, I can see that there's some margin that's applied by the browser. So remember, anytime you see this user agent style sheet, when it says that, well, that's the browser applying its own CSS. So if I turn this off, I turn off what normalized CSS is applying, I can see this is the margins that the browser applies itself. Similarly, if I go look at the P tag, let's look at what's happening with the P tag. All right, border padding. Normalized, notice, is not changing any of the margins, but there already is some margin built into the browser, right? So the browser's already setting before the block. You see, before the block starts, top of the block, it's setting 1 a.m. and at the end of the block, it's setting a 1 a.m. So you're seeing a 1 a.m. margin on both the top and the bottom that's applied by Chrome, right? So I could override that by setting, say, my own margin. Right? And that would remove the margin between the H1 and around that's around the paragraph, right? But if I don't specify a margin, I don't specify padding, if I don't specify any of these things, then it's going to fall back to essentially what is the browser default border, margin, and padding. So that's a thing to keep in mind, is a lot of elements out of the box do have some margin or padding. So namely, all the heading tags H1 through H6 have some built-in margin, and paragraph tags by themselves already have built-in margin as well. It's important to note their div tags never have margin or border built in, right? So if you want margin or border on a div tag, remember they have no semantic meaning. You need to apply that border margin as you see fit. Okay, so we did a few of those things. I'm going to go next to the header tag, and let's add that in. So what we can see now is we're applying some more margin. We're applying some margin to the header. So there already was some, but I'm changing what's there. I'm overriding it, and I'm also adding some padding on the left side. So here I'm saying that I want a different padding on the left side than I want on the right. And if I inspect that, what we'll see here, you can see there's 15 pixels of padding on the left and 10 pixels of padding on the other three sides. So that's how that's working. And namely, that's because we start by applying a 10 pixel padding to all sides, and then we override just the one side to 15. Okay, so there's a few different things going on there. Finally, let's look at the paragraph tag here and see what's going on. So if I look at this paragraph tag, we're saying margin 0 and padding left 15. Okay, so let's look at what that effect that has. So margin, again, notice that removes the margin. I've said there's no margin on any of the side. Padding left 15 pixels, so that's where we're seeing there's a 15 pixel padding on the left when the other three sides are 10. So effectively, this rule that we're seeing here, this padding left, same with this padding left, those are overriding the setting that we have here for both the H1 and the P. So by default, we start by sending them all four sides to 10, and then for both of these tags, we're sending just left side to 15. So again, as I kind of mentioned previously, all four of those sides can have different properties. And we'll go into some more of the specifics of how that works. But that's one of the things you want to keep in mind. One of those things that can be a useful tool. All right, let me get back to my slides. So we looked at how this looks in the browser, kind of went through that. So let's talk about a few of these properties in maybe some more detail. So I can set the width of the content area. I can set that with the width property. And so I can say, well, let's set it to 450 pixels. That's going to be an absolute width, as they would say, right? It's always going to be 450 pixels. The size of that physically is going to change depending on the density of the screen, right? So that may be 10 inches on one, that might be 5 inches on one screen, but 3 inches on another, right? So it's absolute in the sense of the number of pixels and in terms of the viewport size, but it's not in terms of all factors. Okay, so I can also set a relative width, say that this should be 75%, and typically what that means is it's going to be 75% of the container that it's in, right? So that would be three quarters of whatever the width of its container. Okay. I can also set the width to auto, which is usually the default. Auto just says figure it out based on the size of your content, effectively. Now that does vary a little bit depending on what element you're talking about. So for instance, most block elements, div, main, by default they're the full width that's available. But some other elements that may be maybe just how much space it needs. Okay. How to set the height of the content. So we can do the same thing with the height. We can set it to absolute. We can set it to a percentage, say 50%. In my experience, relative heights like this, 50%, tend to not work very well and tend to not work the way you would expect them. So I really avoid trying to use percentages here. Most of the other units work just fine, but specifically percentages have some weird behavior that you might not expect. So I would generally avoid setting a height in terms of percent, because it's the height. It's a percentage of the height of the container, but the height of the container is often determined by the content. So you get kind of in a feedback loop of, well, what determines the height if you're using percentages. So it's usually better to use a quote-unquote absolute value, whether it be EM or pixels or points when you're talking about heights, or just leave it at auto. Auto is a great option too. So auto will just say, we'll figure out the height of this element based on the content that's inside. Okay. We can also specify minimums and maximums for both the width and the height, and these are super useful, especially for responsive design, where we can say, okay, this thing can't be smaller than this, and it can't be bigger than this. So I can say that the minimum width is, well, it has to be at least 450 pixels wide. And I can say, well, a max is, it can't be bigger than 600. Vice versa with the height, I could say, well, it can't be less than 120, it can be higher than 160. Now, all of these four settings don't specifically say that it has to be that value. It just says it has to be bigger or smaller than that value. So oftentimes these are very good things to combine with the width and height settings to give it some kind of constraints, especially if you're saying, well, I'm going to size this in terms of some sort of relative unit, whether it be percentages or VH units or VW units. Oftentimes if you're sizing it in a relativistic fashion, that changes. So you're going to combine a relative width or relative height with a min and a max to kind of constrain how big or small those things can get. If we want to set margins, so there's a few different ways we can set margins. The simplest way is if, say, I want to set the margin of just one side. I want to say margin dash top. Well, that will just be the top, just the right, just the bottom, just the left. So I can set each of the different margins separately as different values, or I can use the shorthand margin property to set them all to be the same. So if I just specify one value with this shorthand margin property, that's going to be all four sides are the same. I can also specify, say, two values. So then the first value, or the verticals, so the top and the bottom are going to be 0 here. And then the horizontal is the next one, so left and right. So this would say top and bottom is 0, and left and right is 1 EM. If I specify three values, okay, then the first value is the top. The second value is the left and right side, the horizontal sides. And then the third value is going to be the bottom. So in this context, I'm saying that the left and the right have the same value. That's the one that probably trips the people up the most. It is a useful shorthand because, again, usually we kind of keep the same margin on left and right, but we have different margins on top and bottom. So this actually applies. That case of having three settings actually applies in a surprisingly large number of cases, but it can be a little bit hard to read and figure out what's going on if it's specified this way, because you have to remember which is which. And then our final fourth option with the shorthand is I can specify all four sides as different. So here I'm saying the top is 0.5, the right is 1 EM, the bottom is 2 EM, and the left is 1 EM. So I can specify that here. Now note that the left and right are both 1 EM, so this and this fourth example, this third example, both of these are technically the same thing. They'll both do the technically the same thing. But sometimes one or the other is maybe more readable. Okay. I can do the same thing with padding, so I can specify individually. I can say just one side, I want to specify what its padding is. So I could say padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left, so I can set those individually. And I can also then do it with the same sort of shorthands that I did with margin. Now, things to keep in mind as just a general rule of thumb, if you're setting padding or margin, the right unit you use usually is rem, R-E-M, the root font size. You can specify them with EM as well. That's a perfectly valid option as well, is to specify them relative to the current font size. But most of the time, your layouts will be much more predictable and maintainable if you specify margin and padding in rem rather than EM. Usually that's a good thing. But you can really do it either way. The difference, the place you're going to see a difference between rem and EM is again in certain things where you're changing the font size. So for instance, if I'm looking at here, see the heading has one font size and then the actual text has a different font size. So if I want both of these to have the same padding, I really do need to specify it in rem. Okay. If I say rem 1 EM, these will be both the same, but if I specify the padding on both of these as 1 EM, they're going to have a different amount of padding because the font sizes are different. Okay. So we mentioned some of this already. The kind of recommended practices for the units and the different places where you should use them. If you're specifying a border or an outline's not really talked about in this chapter, although an outline is very similar to a border, but with some slight differences. Both of those you want to specify in pixels, and the reason being is borders generally don't look good with partial pixels, and any of the other units that you use for borders will end up with partial pixels. They'll end up with half pixels or subpixels. But you really do want your margins, your borders to be a whole number of pixels. So you don't want to get half pixels, which is why we use pixels for those. Outline's the same story. Outline is virtually the same thing as a border. Next up it would be rem. So rem you will usually want to use that for your margins and your padding. And it's also in some cases maybe a good thing to use for your width and height. So because certain things you may want to say, well, this needs to be roughly 20 characters wide, right? So that would be a good case to use rem if you're specifying the dimensions of it relative to a certain number of characters. Same thing with the height. You might want to say this is 1 line tall. Rem would be a good fit. Or 3 lines tall. You'd say 3 rem. So those are good things to specify width and height when it's relative to text that's inside of it. So those are good things to keep in mind. Same thing with min height and max height. You might also set those in rem. Okay. Now VH. Remember, VH is 1% of the viewport size, 1% of the viewport height. That's a good place to use for heights and min heights and max heights, especially specifically when you're doing like page layout. Page layout, if you're trying to lay out how the page should look, you might specify that height with VH units. Similarly, VW would be a good unit to use for the width. I generally would not recommend switching those and saying using viewport width units for height or VH units for width, because that tends to create a lot of very weird behavior in terms of your layout. So you usually want to use the VH with the height and the VW with the width. There are some occasional exceptions to that where you want the weirdness, but typical good rule of thumb is to keep those with the dimension that they go with. Okay, so those should be your primary elements when you're sizing, primary measurements when you're sizing boxes. Again, pixels, rem, VH units, and VW units. Try to avoid, say, points for sizing elements and percentages, because they tend to create problems. Although there's definitely cases where you might say 100% for the width, but I would generally say use auto over using 100%. All right, let's talk about a web page here. So here we've got an example, and this is the main book example. It's called Town Hall. So we can see what it looks like with all of these margins and these padding and widths, all of those things defined. You can find that under Book Apps, Chapter 5, Town Hall. So there's the main page, is what it looks like in the browser. We can look at the individual properties that have been applied to that. So we can see, let me maybe pull that example up first before we get going here. So let me switch over to here so you can see Visual Studio, VS Code, and I'm going to open that folder. So open folder, go up to Book Apps, and we're going to go into Chapter 5. I'm going to open up the Town Hall folder. Okay, so we've got Town Hall open, and here. All right, so let's run that in the browser. Okay, so here we can see what that looks like. And I can see that there's a few different things applied in terms of the CSS. So if I were to look at what this looks like without my style sheet, / hide that. So you can see this is kind of what it looks like without applying any CSS on top of it. Pretty bland, pretty stale. The CSS is going to make it look a lot better. All right, so let's go through what some of those things are. So let's start at the top. Actually, maybe I should just go through some of these just by themselves. So let's look at, say, the body. So the body has a few things set on it. In terms of just looking at box sizing, I might want to just look at, well, okay, so the body is set to 700 pixels. Okay, so what that means is this has basically been designed for screens that are around 700 pixels. In practice, what that means is if you're seeing something that's been set as a width of 700 pixels, that means it was designed for screens that are 800 by 600 pixels wide, which several years ago was a pretty common screen size. 800 by 600, that was a reasonable target. Since we've got mobile devices, most mobile devices are not 800 pixels wide, so this is actually would not be very mobile friendly, because if I collapse this down, you see what happens, and now there's a scroll bar. That's not what I want to do. Okay, so again, this is kind of the maybe an old way of doing things. So the width sets it down to 700 pixels, and what this is going to do without those two properties, let me go and let's look at, let's inspect this. So let's see what happens if I don't set those things on the body. So out of the box, it wouldn't have a width or a margin set, right? So out of the box, the entire page would go to the left and right edge, all four edges really, of the viewport, right? So I may want to create some offset. So that's partially where the width comes in. So I say rather than using the entire width that's available, maybe I set it down to 700 pixels, okay, because that's going to give me some room to put spacing on the sides. So here we're saying, well, let's set the width to 700 pixels. All right, so that gives me some leftover space, but notice all the leftover space is now on the right side, right? So what's on the, it's all the way on the left, and it is 700 pixels wide. It's constrained to that. It can't be bigger or smaller than that, but it's not centered, right? So my goal with setting it to 700 pixels is to get it centered and then have some space on both sides. So that's what this margin does, okay? So remember, when I'm setting margin like this, the first setting is the vertical margin, and the second setting is the horizontal margin. So the first one says set the margin to 1 EM. Okay, so that's where we have 1 EM on top and bottom. Now, when I'm setting margin in the horizontal direction, here notice I'm setting it to auto. Okay, auto says take up any leftover space that's either on the left or the right, and then divvy that up between the sides that are asking for auto margins. So this is setting auto margin on the left and the right, which means that 50% of the leftover space is going to get used as margin on both sides. Now, this combines with the width setting. So for instance, if I just had margin but not the width set, you can see that it's still going to be all the way over to the left and right edges because there's no extra space left over. There's no space left over to divvy up and use as spacing. So in order for this auto margin to work, there has to be already leftover space because we've changed the width otherwise. Okay. So now that there's leftover space, you can see at this kind of size, that auto margin is giving it 201 pixels to both sides. If I make this a bit smaller, it's still big enough. See, say on a smaller screen, that would be 27. Go back up to a higher screen width, and maybe here we have 357, right? So the size of that margin changes based on how big your screen is. But it always, if we set a fixed width and then we put margin auto left on the left and right, it's going to center it. So this is one way to center blocks. Okay, we can use margin auto on the left and right, and that will result in something that is centered. Okay, so that can be super helpful. But as I've kind of said, this is kind of the old way to do it because this really only works with devices that are 800 by 600 or bigger. This is not going to work for mobile devices. So the way I would do the same thing nowadays, rather than centering it that way and saying that it should have a fixed width of 700, the way I would do this nowadays to be a bit more responsive, I would actually just go ahead and set some fixed margins on all sides. So let's say I set 1 EM in the vertical and 3 EM in the horizontal. All right, so it's going to take up a little bit more space here, but it means that as I go down, it doesn't break as nearly as badly as it did for mobile devices. Right, so let me undo that. Let me refresh this page so we get back to what it was originally, right? Versus here on mobile devices, you get it with a horizontal scroll bar. So if I use margin values like that are not fixed, that solves it. The other way to go about this, rather than saying the width has to be exactly 700, if I set the max width instead of the width. Okay, so for larger screen size, I won't notice any different if I set the max width here. But if I scale it down, what you'll see as things start getting smaller, see, it doesn't fall off the screen. Okay, so it's still got a chance to do word route. But you will notice that now there's, on a smaller screen, that there's no margin on the left and right. So there's some trade-offs here with the different approaches. Okay. So that's the thing to keep in mind. If you set the max width instead of the width, it's actually going to behave a little bit better on mobile. So you still have the same behavior on desktop, but you have a different behavior on mobile. I would say overall, though, it's this again used to be a good way to build websites in the past, maybe back late 90s, early 2000s, where we'd say, okay, the body has a fixed width, and then we divvy up some space on the left and right. That was okay as something we would do in, again, 90s, early 2000s. But this is typically not how we design websites nowadays. We typically want to make use of the space over here and the space over here, rather than wasting that space. As well as the question about mobile devices. All right, so let's go back to the slides. Or I guess maybe I should go through some of the other pieces. Let's look at before we go on, talk about the headings. So the headings we can see have a margin and padding of 0. So here we've got those, which is interesting because you'll notice that there actually is some say margin on the H2, right? So what that comes down to, first we tell them the 0, but then there's another setting for specifically H2 that's in the header that sets the margin bottom to 0.25 EM. I think there's the same thing for specifically the header. So we're starting off saying all the headers and all the paragraphs shouldn't have spacing, but then when we're overriding that on a kind of area by area basis. So header H3, header H2, both of those have margin bottom. Well, the H2 has margin bottom, but all right. So that gives space there. Let's look at effectively, I guess what they're trying to do with this rule is remove the default margin and padding. So looking at the next rule, which is for the unordered list. So the unordered list here, let me just inspect. There we go. Okay. So we're seeing what are we applying there? So we're saying 0, 0, 1.5 as our margin. So the first one, remember, is our top. The next one is our horizontal, left and right. And then the third one is going to be our bottom. So in this example, I have margin on the bottom, but I don't have margin on any of the other 3 sides. So that's what they're trying to do, is separate that there. The LIs, let's look at that. So each LI has some margin on it, or sorry, padding. So there's a little bit of padding on the bottom, but not on the other sides. Let's look at paragraphs. So looking at this paragraph here, I can see that there is a little bit of padding on the top and bottom, and no margin. So there's a little bit of padding on each of these paragraphs. Okay. Let's go next. So then we'll see, if we're looking at the CSS, we'll see there's specifically styles that apply to the header. So if I'm looking at the CSS file here, I'm going to see that we've got the body, we've got these general selectors that are being used to select by tag, and then we've got a few additional selectors here that are specifically for the header. So header image, header H2, header H3. Remember, if you have 2 selectors like that with a space between them, that's a descendant selector. So we're talking only about the image, the H2, and the H3 that are inside of the header. Okay. So we're applying some styling to those. And then we'll see that there's more styling. So this applies specifically to a few different elements in the main. There's some specific styles that are being applied to the footer and only the footer. Okay, so that's a typical kind of way to arrange your CSS files. That's pretty normal. You might start with just the general styles that you have, and then go through for each of these sections. So here's specifically for header, here's specifically for main, specifically for footer. That's not a bad way to arrange your CSS. All right, going back to slides. So just refreshing where we're at. So this is what it looks like in the browser. Now, remember that we saw in the user agent, we saw there's a few places where the user agent automatically applies margins to the headers and the headers, as well as the paragraph tags. So we may want to override that. So one way to override that is using something called a reset selector. Okay, the idea with the reset selector is it resets your margin and padding to 0. Okay, so the way we write that is we add in a universal selector. So we're going to say star margin padding, and if I'm looking at the other example here, there's two different versions of it. So if I go to main 2 CSS, you'll see that reset selector is up at the top. Okay, so that reset selector says everything in this page, just set the margin and padding to 0. So that used to be that's one way that you can try and work around the differences between the different browsers. Say maybe Safari applies one size margins and Chrome applies a different size margins. That's one way to kind of get around it, so that in theory your HTML looks like it's the same. But in practice, this sort of universal reset tends to create a lot of problems. It has a lot of unintended side effects. So while the book kind of suggests that maybe you should do this, maybe you should use a universal reset, really modern web development, modern web design, this is not a recommended practice. I would not recommend you to do a CSS reset this way. So what we do instead is we use, say, a normalized CSS, which we talked about in a previous page, and you can follow the link here to get the actual file. So rather than resetting using a CSS reset like this, generally we're going to use normalized CSS instead to smooth over those differences in browsers, because that has a lot less side effects to specifically say this tag, oh, let's do this, this tag, let's do this, rather than saying everything, let's set it to margin 0, padding 0, tends to create a lot more problems and a lot more work for us to do. So that's not, this is not a recommended practice anymore to use this universal CSS reset. It's better to use something much more targeted, and that's where normalized CSS comes in. Okay, so the book examples will have this in several of their style sheets, but it's just better to use normalized CSS instead and leave that out. Okay, so we talked about padding and we talked about margin. Let's talk a little bit about borders. So remember, padding and margin, they're just white space. So they just tell you how big you want that white space to be, right? How much space do you want there to be between the padding is how much space do you want there to be between the border and the actual content, and margin, remember, is between the border and other elements. So the border is kind of this line that we can, that line that we can put around the content. So there's a few different ways to specify that. If I say border, just border, then I'm specifying all of it at once. Okay. I can also say border dash side, and then I'll be specifying the properties for just a single side. I can get more granular in there, so I could say, well, I want to set the width, the style, or the color, because if I'm using, say, the border property, this is a shorthand. So when I specify border like this, I have to specify 3 things. I have to specify the width of the border, the style of the border, and then the color. And we'll go through what each of those means. Okay, so I can set everything this way. That will put all the borders to be, all four borders to be the same. Or I could say like border left, border right, border top or border bottom, and then set that on a per side basis. Again, border top would just be setting the things from the top. So I can do that. Or I can say, let's set the border width for all four sides. I can set the border style for all four sides, or I can set the border color for all four sides. On a similar note, I can do that then on a per side basis as well. So if I want to just say, I just want to set the width of the right border, I might say border right width. That would be how I would specify that. Now, it is important the order of those words. So if I say border width right, it's actually not going to have any effect. It's just going to ignore that because that's invalid CSS. So the side, if it's right, left, top, or bottom, that does have to come as the second word. Okay, so some examples of how I might write this. Let's say I just want a green border. I could say let's create a thin, solid green border. Okay, so that's going to create a thin border around the element. Or I could say let's specify the width of the border in pixels. Again, that's usually the unit you want to use for borders is pixels. So 2 pixels as a dashed, and then here's the color, right? So if we think about what that color is, 80, 80, 80, all the numbers are the same, so it's going to be some shade of gray. Because red, green, blue, they're all the same. Okay, it's going to be some shade of gray. All right, so 1 pixel inset, we have another style, and here we haven't specified the color. So if you don't specify the color, it's going to use the color of the text, right? So if I have black text, the border is going to be black. If I have white text, the border is going to be white. Now, typically, your borders are not going to, you usually don't want your borders to be the same color as your text. There's plenty of rules around that where you might want to do that, but most of the time it's worth it to go ahead and set the color, even if it's going to be the same as your text, because very rarely that will be the case, and it often changes, even if it is that case at one point in time. So that's how to set borders on all 4 sides. Those are some examples. Or if I wanted to set it on just a specific side, I could say border top 2 pixels, solid black. So give me a thin, solid border on the top, or I could do it on just the right. So here I'm just saying border right, 4 pixels, double blue. I can also I've got a few other ways I can set that. So I could say border width. If I just specify one value, that's going to be, okay, so the border width on all 4 sides is 1 pixel. Similar to how we did it with the margin and the padding, that's the same way it falls here. So if there's 2 values, the first one is the vertical. The second one is the horizontal, the left and right. And then the width, if the border width, if I set that as 3 values, it's top, horizontal, bottom, or top, right, bottom, left. So it follows the same rule for 1, 2, 3 or value 1, 2, 3 or 4 values as it does for margin and padding. It's the same ordering. Okay. So border style, I can specify the border style for all 4 sides. So that would, here I would be saying dashed, and here I'm saying, well, I want 2 different values, so solid and none. So that first value is my vertical, so it would have a solid border on the top and the bottom, and then it would have no border on the left and the right. Okay. I can also set border color, so that just being the color values that we have that we talked about before. So if I specify 1 color, that applies to all 4 sides. If I specify 2 colors, the first one is, again, vertical, and the second value would be horizontal, so left and right. Okay, so all of these follow that same rule that we've seen with 1, 2, 3, or 4 values. And then if I want to specify these even more granularly, not using any of the shorthands, I might say border bottom width. So that's specifically only to one size and only setting 1 property. Okay, now let's look at maybe what these different border styles are and what they look like. So there's a few different keywords that you can use when you're specifying the border style. So first of all, none means there's no border, as you can see here. Dotted means that there's kind of dots, as you can see, going around. Dashed, dashed. Solid, this is the one we use the most. Typically, if you're wanting to add a border, most of the borders we add will be just solid borders. You can also add here, you see double border, so that will have 2 lines. And then there's these other 3 that kind of look 3D: groove, ridge, inset, outset. These have kind of been with us for a long time, and they were things that we would use, I'd say, more if you're building websites, 10, 20 years ago. But nowadays we very rarely use any of these 3D styles, because we have better tools that look, most of the time will end up looking better. So those do exist: groove, ridge, inset, outset. There are some cases where that does look good, but most of the time, if you're looking for a border, if you're trying to add a border to something, go ahead and just start with solid. And then if solid is maybe not the right thing, then you might want to use one of the others. And usually we use one of the others to kind of, when there's already something that's solid, to say separate it or distinguish between, well, this thing and that other thing. So those are the top 5 are kind of the most used ones nowadays. Okay, so if we're gonna also, one of the things that's been added, 2 of the things that have been added in relatively recent versions of CSS, this would be CSS 3, is the border radius setting. So the border radius allows us to have rounded corners around our borders. So by default, all of the corners are going to be sharp, okay, if we don't set a border radius. And notice that the border radius is not part of any of those previous settings that we'd set. So I can't set a border radius as part of any of these, here. Border, border side, border width, border style color. None of these will set the radius, so it's always something we have to set on top of setting the border. Okay, so I can say border radius and then just set it to a value. So let's say I say border radius 0.5 em. Well, then that will be, all 4 corners will be rounded with that specific radius. Okay, effectively, the greater your radius, the more rounded it will be, the more like a circle it will be, or an oval or whatever. Yeah, more like a circle. So that we can set the border radius. We can also set the border radius on a per corner basis. Now note this is different because border radius applies to corners and not sides, right? So if I specify the border radius for each of these different sides, I say the top left corner, the top right corner, the lower right corner, and then the lower left corner. So it kind of goes around in a circle. Okay, so I can set it all as the same radius, or I can set it as different radiuses for each of the different corners. Starting with rounded corners on all 4 sides is a really good place to start and just kind of play around with it. But there are also some really nice effects that you can create if you have different radiuses on different sides. So for instance, maybe you have a radius of 0.5 em. You do have the top rounded and the bottom's not, or the bottom's rounded, the top's not, the right's rounded, the left's not, vice versa, you might say. There's a lot of different things you can do with that to make things look cool. Box shadow is also another thing that's been added in CS3. That gives us what we call, oftentimes in the graphic design world, you might call that a drop shadow. So it kind of puts a shadow behind your text or your element, which helps the text really, or the elements stand out but behind what's there. So let's look at an example with this. So I've got a simple section tag here. It's just got an anchor inside of it. Okay, so what we're doing is we're adding a border and we're also adding a shadow to it. So here we're first going to set the border. So the border is 5 pixels wide, It's a double border, so you can see there's 2 lines on it, and it's blue. Okay, so 5 pix double borders, double blue, so that's our basic setting. And then if I just had left that, all of those corners would be, remember, square. Okay, but here I'm going to make them rounded. So top left is 10. So here we've got a nice rounded corner here, 10 pixel here. And then I go to, what was this? Top right. So I'm going to go over to the next one. So on the top left we have 10 pixels. You can kind of see it's short. It's a little bit rounded, but not that rounded. Then I can go over here and look. Okay, well we've got 20 pixels, so there's a more rounded corner. And then down to 0, so it's still sharp down here. And then 20 pixels. So you can actually see both of these are set to 20 pixels. They're the same rounding, but they're different than the top left corner. So this is where you can get some interesting effects if you set each of the one of the examples of getting some interesting effect by setting the radiuses to different on the 4 different corners. You can also see this red sort of halo there. That is the shadow. That's the box shadow that's setting that. So there's a few different values here. We can see that there's 4 different measurements: 3 pixels, 3 pixels, 4 pixels, 4 pixels, and then red. So that last setting is the color of the drop shadow. But what are the other 4 values? So let's look at that. So the first 2 values are the horizontal offset and then the vertical offset. So the horizontal offset says those 2 said where should the shadow be relative to the thing that's casting the shadow. So a positive offset will move it to, horizontal offset will move it to the right. A negative horizontal offset will move it to the left. And a vertical offset would move the shadow down, or a negative vertical offset would move it up. So you're moving it left, right, up, or down relative to the element that's casting the shadow. The blur radius then is also a measurement, and that says how blurry should the edges of that shadow be. Okay, so if you set that to 0, you'll have really sharp shadows, and the higher you make that, the more blurry the shadow will be. And then spread, I forget exactly how that works. Although the spread is usually something that I basically just set to the same thing as the. Oh, no, the spread, I remember. So spread, what it does is it actually scales the shadow up. So if you had a spread of 0, then your shadow would be the exact same size as the thing that's casting the shadow. So a 4 pixel spread makes it 4 pixels taller and wider in both dimensions, so in all dimensions. So here we've got, this is 4 pixels up, 4 pixels down, 4 pixels to the left, 4 pixels to the right, and that's why you can see it poking out outside the border up here, is because the shadow is actually bigger than the thing. That's what the spread does, is it scales up the shadow and makes it bigger. Okay, so we talked about, we just talked about those newer properties, border radius and box shadow. I want to talk about the background properties next. So there's a few different properties we can set for background. The first one just being background. Background is your shorthand that will set all of the values that we're about to talk about. Background color, if I just want to set the background to a specific solid color, that's what I would use. So I could maybe say background color red, and that would set it to the background of the element to red. I could set the background of the element to an image, and that's where I would use background image. Then when I'm dealing with images, repeat usually goes along with that to say if there's additional space, if the image is not as big as the thing I'm applying it to, well, what should I do? Should I make copies? Or should I only have one copy of it? Or maybe I should repeat it horizontally or repeat it vertically. So there's a few different values we can specify. By default, background images repeat in both the horizontal and the vertical directions. Okay. By default, it repeats in both directions. Okay. So I can say repeat, which is the default. That's both directions. I can say no repeat, which means it doesn't repeat in either of the directions. So there'll only be the first copy of it in both directions. If I say repeat X, then it would repeat in the horizontal direction, but not the Y direction. If I say repeat Y, it would repeat horizontally, but not vertically. Okay, so all of these are helpful. There's also the background attachment setting, which by default your backgrounds move as you scroll. They're kind of attached to the element that you apply it to, but there's another option that you can use as the background attachment fixed. And what that means is that the background doesn't move when you scroll, which can sometimes create some interesting effects. It can also get weird. So it's kind of one of those things that you kind of play around with in places where it maybe makes sense, where it might make things look better. But a lot of times I would just recommend sticking with background scroll, because there's enough weird behavior that can happen with that it's not always what you want. And it tends to kind of create an effect where the thing is kind of floating over the background and the background is stationary. It's something you should kind of look at and see what it looks like. But I would typically stick with scrolling backgrounds for most. Background position is also one we can specify, which will change where the background image is kind of relative to the element. Okay, so those are different properties. Let's talk about some more specifics. So we've got the background property, color, image, position. There's also a newer one, which actually is super important, but it's not in your book. This is a new property in CSS3 called background size. And I'll go over that briefly, but it's tremendously useful when you're dealing with backgrounds. So we talked about several of those already. The background property itself is a shorthand for all of the other ones. Okay, so it'll override all of them whether you set them or not. So some of them are optional. If you don't specify all of them, it'll kind of reset them to their defaults. So the first thing you can do is you can specify the color, you can specify image, you can specify the position and the size. Okay, so if you're specifying both of those things, then it's position/size. You can't specify the size without the position. In order to specify the size, you do have to add in a position. Okay, and then there's also repeat and attachment. Now, technically, most of these properties can kind of actually be in whatever order you want them to. This isn't true for a lot of CSS properties. A lot of CSS properties, they need to be in a specific order. But with background, you can actually put them in whatever order you want. But here's this is the order I would recommend you put them into. At least what you can see from the syntax. Okay, so if I want the background to just be solid blue, I could specify it with this, background blue. If I want it to be an image that's on top of any transparency areas, it'll have blue show through, or if the image isn't loaded, it'll fall back to blue. I could specify it this way. So here we have blue, and then the image I'm going to put on top of that. And notice that I have a relative path to that image. So it's ... images texture .gif. So when you're specifying images like this, notice that you have to put in URL parentheses. If you just put the string directly there, it won't load the image. You do have to put that into the URL parenthesis syntax there to refer to that file. Okay, so we have that. Maybe if we look more deeply, look at the third example. So we're setting it to kind of a gray. We're using color code. We're setting it to an image, so header.png. Then we're setting some additional settings. So here we're saying center it, and then make it 80% of its original size. Yeah, that is size. So center it behind whatever we're applying it to. Make it a little bit smaller, and then repeat it in the Y direction and have it scroll as you move. Okay, so that's some example using the shorthand property. If I'm going to set it individually using the other settings, I could say background color is blue, background image is yada yada. So let's talk about a few of these other properties. So background repeat again can be a few different values. It can be repeat, repeat X, repeat Y, no repeat. Kind of went over what those are. Background position says where should it be relative to the elements that's in there. So for instance, I could say background position left top. So horizontally it would be on the left and then on the top. That's usually the default placement for your backgrounds. If you don't specify a position, it'll be the top left. And then if I wanted to maybe center it horizontally, I could say background position center top. So horizontally it'll be in the center, and then the top of it would be at the top. And if you're going to set positions like this, especially that second option where you want to center it, you want to make sure that you turn repetition off, especially in the horizontal direction. So you'll probably want to set this to no repeat if you're setting a background position. And then background attachment of either scroll or fixed. So general guideline for backgrounds, colors, images. For accessibility purposes, you want to make sure that that background color or image doesn't make the text hard to read. So that means that, for instance, if you have a very dark image, you should have light text over it, or a dark color. Or if you have a light background, then you should have dark text over it. So those two things should contrast. Another property in CSS3, and I kind of mentioned this already, this is not in your book, so pay attention here. I have given a link for more info about this, but this is one thing that's not in your book, but is really actually pretty important. So background size can be one of two values basically. You can also set it to percentages, but the most useful values are these two keywords: contain or cover. Okay, so what contain does, if you set a background to the background size to contain, what it'll do is it'll try to scale the image up or down as big as it can be, as long as it is contained in that box. So none of the image data will be lost. It won't be off the top edge, bottom edge, left or right. So none of the image data will be lost, but there will be some empty or white space on the sides where it doesn't fit. So for instance, if there's space on the left and right sides, then you'll see white space there because it can't scale it up, or you'll see space on the top and bottom. So either be on the top and bottom, and it'll be potentially centered, or it be, background position is what centers it. So you can say either you can have the white space on the left and right, or top and bottom, depending on what the size and shape of things are, or you can set the background size to cover. So what cover says, fill the entire space. Don't leave any white space. Don't leave any white space places where the image isn't left. But it means that you are going to lose part of the image data. So that may be the top and bottom if it fits that way, or it might be the left and right. You might be losing those depending on the dimensions and the aspect ratios of both the background and the element itself. So there's a lot of places where you might want to use one or the other. If you're familiar with what a jumbotron is usually an element that we put up at the top of a page to kind of put a header on there, kind of tell the user about what's going on. Those are really good places for, jumbotrons are really good places for these background size or background cover. So the gist of why these are important is really comes down to, a lot of times the aspect ratio of the image is not the same as the aspect ratio of the thing you're showing it in. So you can use this to kind of dynamically change the image to be in the aspect ratio of the, get the image into the aspect ratio of the element you're trying to show it behind. Okay, so another way we talked about setting backgrounds with colors, just solid colors. We talked about setting them with images. We can also set them to be linear gradients as of CSS3. So it'd be gradients. So you got some examples here. Here you've got a gradient that starts white on the left and fades to the right and becomes red. Or here it starts red, fades to white, and then fades to blue. And you can see it's kind of diagonally shifted. So the syntax for specifying these gradients, we apply it to the background image property, but instead of saying like URL parentheses, we say linear gradient parentheses. So the first setting is the direction. Okay, what direction does the gradient go? And then all the values after that are the series of colors and which percentage do you want to see those colors at. So for instance, in the top example, we've got a linear gradient that goes to the right. So that's the direction. And then we can see it starts at white at 0%. That'd be at the beginning. And then it's red at 100%. So 0%, 100%. Similar with the bottom example, we can see the direction is 45 degrees. So that's what gives it that slanted look. And it starts at red at 0%. It's white actually directly in the middle, so 50%, and then blue at the end. So each of these percentages says at what point does it need to hit that color. Now, typically when we use gradients, we will want those to be kind of smooth gradients like that. But you can also kind of tweak this and make those edges pretty sharp if you want to. So here we've got a 45-degree angle. We start at red at 0%. We go to a red again at 33%, 1/3 of the width. And then immediately at 30%, we go from red to white, which is where you don't see any quote-unquote gradient actually happening here. So red to white, 33%, then same thing at 66%, we go directly from white to blue to finally being blue at the end. So because these values are doubled up, I'm saying red 33, white 33, that's why you don't see any sort of gradation from red to white, and same thing with the blue, white 66, blue 66, it immediately switches from one to the other, because I haven't given it any values in between. Okay, so that's some examples. There's some more links here that you can read up more about how to play with gradients and what those, some of those values are. There's also some more stuff in your book about gradients. So let's look at an example with all these things kind of applied. So here we've got a gradient background. So we start with kind of a light color up at the top of the page. It goes down to sort of a tan yellowish color. That's where we're applying a gradient. That's pretty normal to kind of a common style decision to sometimes to apply gradients to the background. Sometimes we'll do gradients on buttons as well. So there we've got that. You'll notice though that the inner part of this page is white. So that's because we've set a gradient on the, I think the HTML, if I were to look at this. Yeah, so linear gradient was on the actual HTML, but the body doesn't have the background is set to a background color of white. If I didn't set a background color of white, you would still see the gradient through there. So things like that, usually if we're going to have a gradient background and then apply something else on top of it, we need to also then give that a colored background. So we have a gradient background on the HTML and then a white background on the body. And you can see that there's a border, right? So a thin border around the body. And you can see that we've got rounded corners on each of the four sides. So if we look at the CSS for that, you can see that here. So we got a 1 pixel solid black border we've got a border radius of 25 pixels, but you can also see there's a bit of a drop shadow. So here's how that falls out. You can kind of see the drop shadow looks pretty sharp, but you can see it on the right and the bottom edges. And that makes it look like the actual content is a little bit above the background. Okay, so those are where those things come in. So that's as much as I wanted to kind of go over that part. Oh, I might mention briefly, you'll see that there's a border, just a single-sided border here, this orangish line, as well as one here. And that's being applied through, the header has a border bottom and the footer has a border top, right? So the top, this border is on the bottom of the header and this border is on the top of the footer. And that's where those lines are coming from. So there's an exercise in here that they kind of point you to maybe get some experience with that. And that's short 5.1. If you're looking at the short exercises, this would be chapter 1, exercise 1. To kind of go through and they'll give you the HTML and some basic CSS for this page, and then to go through and style it with borders and padding and margin and background and such. Okay, so to kind of refresh on what we talked about here today, we talked about the CSS box model. That was our main focus here. And remember I talked about the background. One thing I might mention before going too far, the background is always behind both the padding and the content. Padding and the content both get that background, but once you get to the border, the background stops at the border and is, so it's the border, the background does not apply to the border or the margin. Okay. So we talked about the CSS box model. At this point you should be able to kind of explain what that is and know what the difference between, say, margin, border, and padding is, and to understand how to kind of configure the width and heights. Remember, you can say width and height explicitly, but you can also specify min width and max width. Same thing for the height. We talked a little bit about those collapsed margins. So remember, collapsed margins are, again, if I remember right, they're only in the vertical direction and they're not applied in the horizontal direction. We talked about a few different values that you can set for the box model. We talked about the height, we talked about the width, talked about margin, padding, border, background color, and background image. And then we also talked about some of the newer CSS features, from rounded corners to shadows to box shadows to background gradients, and also in there kind of mentioned a few of the other things that came in as well, like box sizing and background size. Okay, so that's the end of this video. That's the end of the lecture for chapter 5. Your reading assignments are up on Perusal, and your homework and lab assignments will be up on Inside Rankin. So get to work on that, and I'll catch up with you later. All right, thank you.